Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Mosman Council's Climate Action Forum. It's with great pleasure that we invite you to participate in this forum, and I apologise for the delays that have occurred to date, but I'm pleased to announce we've got a stellar list of speakers tonight who will be presenting from their own perspectives climate change actions and policies, and it will also be an opportunity for you yourselves to contribute. Hopefully, in opening up this application and viewing this webinar, you have seen a panel which includes Q&A questions you can ask. If you'd like to write those in, our moderators will look at those and publish them, and there will be opportunities for us to put those questions to the speakers tonight. Before I hand over to the Mayor to formally welcome you all to this online webinar, I'll just go through the list of speakers that we have and also give you an idea of the timeframes that we will be taking. So first of all, we will have the Mayor, Councillor Carolyn Corrigan, to formally welcome you all, and then that will be closely followed by Zali Steggall, our federal member for Warringah. We then have a short pre-recorded message from Matt Kean, our State Minister for the Environment and Energy. Unfortunately, he was unable to be in this webinar in person live due to work commitments. We then have Professor David Schlosberg, who's a Professor of Environmental Politics at the University of Sydney and Director of the Sydney Environmental Institute. And then again, we have another recorded message from our state member here on the North Shore, Felicity Wilson, who will be in conversation with Matt Kean and be getting some questions from some students at Mosman Public. We round out tonight with a presentation from our own climate change specialist, Dr. Ruth Irwin, and she will be telling us about some of the activities and actions we're already doing here at Mosman Council, and some things you yourselves at home might wish to do or attempt to do to abate climate change in your own backyards. At the end of this, there will be a question and answer session, as I mentioned, but I would like to hopefully wrap up proceedings in approximately an hour and a quarter at about 7:15. So with no further ado, to get things underway, I will now hand over to our Mayor, Councillor Carolyn Corrigan.
Thank you, Dominic, and a warm remote welcome to everyone attending tonight's Mosman Council Inaugural Climate Forum. I would like to begin this evening, as always, by recognising the traditional inhabitants of the land on which we are meeting tonight, including the Warringah and the Camaragal people, acknowledge Aboriginal elders past and present, and pay respect to them and to their heritage. As Dominic said, we have a stellar lineup of speakers tonight, representatives from every level of government, plus internationally renowned academics, who are speaking tonight to you largely as one voice and on one issue, and that is taking action to mitigate man-made climate change. To comprehensively address climate change, every level of government in Australia needs to act urgently and act with strong and decisive leadership. In November last year, Mosman Council took the decisive step of declaring a climate emergency. Immediately, the hunt was on to find the right person to strengthen Council's environmental and sustainability team and to start work on a comprehensive climate action plan. This was followed in July when Council unanimously adopted the following resolution: to achieve a net zero emission target for all council operations by 2030 and to set an aspirational net zero emission target for our community by 2040. The Climate Action Plan will complement Council's current environmental management plan and will incorporate existing environmental functions and climate action mitigation actions already undertaken by Council. The plan will spell out an emissions reduction pathway that will be costed and will be in line with our overarching strategic plan, the MOS plan. The plan will also provide leadership guidance and education to assist our community with its emissions reduction pathway. Council is really excited to tap into the wealth, knowledge and passion in our community when it adopts its Climate Action Community Consultation Committee. Anyone interested in nominating has until September the 16th, and please check out our website for any further details. Our collective journey has begun, and with tonight's excellent roll-up, I have total confidence that Mosman can meet its targets and that we will all do our bit to tackle the climate crisis. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor, and well said. I will now hand over to the federal member for Warringah, a face that will be familiar to many of you and a name that will also ring some bells. Zali has obviously campaigned on the issue of climate change, and so we're very interested to hear from her about how that's faring and about what other matters she may be addressing both remotely and while she's in Canberra. Over to you, Zali.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mayor Corrigan and Mosman Council for inviting me. It really is an important topic to be addressing. Firstly, I would also like to pay my respects to the first people of Warringah, the Gayamagal, the Gamaragal and the Borogagal, to their elders past and present. May we work together for a sustainable, prosperous future for all future generations. Now, I think we can't start the conversation about climate without maybe acknowledging our environment, and we had a pretty big week last week in Parliament when it comes to the environment. We had the Environmental Protection, Biodiversity and Conservation Act amendment that was put through the lower house of the Parliament. I was fairly upset with that. It was not good legislation. We have a mandated 10-year review of our conservation laws. The review, we have an interim report to date, the Samuels review. The interim report recommended that, well, identified that we really are not doing enough. We are falling behind, and our current laws are not protective enough. Unfortunately, the government's reaction was not to wait for the final review or put stronger laws in place. It was actually to dilute our protective laws. So passed in the lower house legislation that failed to address a number of the recommendations that the Samuel review had required, essentially divesting the decision making to state governments. Now, state governments, I would argue, are conflicted because they have self-interest of revenue that comes from large projects, and so it's very difficult for them to then apply a protective aspect to the approval process. So I had moved some amendments around water triggers so that the decisions as to water use should not be left to state, especially where it relates to large coal and gas projects, and around national environmental standards. Unfortunately, the debate got gagged by the government, and so the bill is now before the will be before the Senate when the Parliament resumes in October, and it will be up to the crossbench in the Senate to oppose it. So anyone very vocal on this issue should write to senators, in particular the crossbench senators, and ensure that they block this legislation. But on climate, we've got a lot of other things to talk about, and I'm happy to take some questions about those events. It's clear that 2020 has been a really tough year, and we've all, it's been a real challenge from a health point of view, and especially an economic point of view. But what we do have is the Prime Minister has been listening to the science on the virus, and the premiers have been, and we absolutely must do the same on climate. We need to stand up and listen to the science. And what we have is, amidst the sort of the economic devastation of the pandemic, is we have an opportunity for a clean recovery from this recession. And legislation around climate change can actually facilitate this. So this is not a question of the economy or the environment, it's actually a question of the economy and the environment. So 2020, bushfires, drought, COVID-19, I mean, it really has been a shock, and it really has, you know, not just to the Australian economy, but to the global economy. The disruption has been across all sectors, and it has been that brutal reminder that we are not isolated from world events, that we can't just carry on without feeling the impacts of what's going to happen around the world. So, and it is that comparison where it comes to the arguments when it comes to climate change, which have often been that we're only a small player, and so what can we really do? So what it really shows is the facts are we are a big player, but also that no one is immune, and that we are in a global society and we have global problems we have to address. Now, in terms of what coming out of the pandemic, if we address some of the opportunities that we really can transition to where we need to be to address climate change. So that opportunity is something that I'm urging the government to embrace, but at the moment they are falling short of really doing that. Because if properly embraced, we really can unlock immense productivity and environmental benefits. What is missing in Australia is that we don't have policy framework, and that is where the climate change bill comes in. But first, I think we all need to be realistic about where we're at. The Australian Bureau of Statistics estimates that we've lost about 520,000 jobs so far during the pandemic. In June, a survey of 22 economists was published, and the economists agreed that the unemployment would remain higher than 7% for the next several years. So it really is going to take a long-term concerted plan to get us back on track. And of course, we know that it is overwhelmingly the younger generation who's going to bear that burden. It's right that we need to be fiscally prudent, but we are going to have to inject money into the economy. And what we really need to see is that public funds are spent for good long-term economic opportunity and job opportunity. And so the only answer there is to that is that it needs to be a climate smart stimulus, because we know it is such a challenge ahead. It will boost employment and it will reduce emissions at the same time. Now, we know climate impacts are accelerating. Professor Thomas Kompas at the University of Melbourne, they have really important work on the question of the costs of climate change. They've estimated that the temperature goals, if we fail to meet the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, the Australian economy will suffer something like $2.7 trillion in cumulative damages over the next three decades. And I think we can fairly say we all got a glimpse of that this summer, with the cost of that, with cost going into billions when it comes to the communities impacted by bushfires, our tourism impacted by smoke, our cities cloaked by smoke. So it really is a summer that we may want to forget, but we should never forget it, because actually it's a lesson we really need to have imprinted in our mind of the kind of future we have unless we take proper action. So the combination of the virus and climate is a fiscal burden on younger generations that we simply have to address, and it's never been seen before. At the moment, youth unemployment is actually astronomically high at 16.3%, and they are the generation that will bear the burden of climate impacts. So the government has an absolute responsibility to step in and deliver that long-term policy that will provide generational equity. Oxford University has recently shown that it's a win-win situation, that if you invest into clean technologies, there will be an economic uplift. So you get about double the amount of jobs for the same investment in clean technologies as you do in fossil fuel technologies. So in a situation where our job shortage is dire, it absolutely must be a priority. We've seen, of course, many countries are going that way. The International Monetary Fund are calling on governments to focus on a green recovery. We've seen the European Union focus, they've just passed a 7-year budget of $500 billion to go to climate smart initiatives. So many countries are focusing on that. And it's about looking at all the ways in which we can build it into the recovery package, whether it is around solar, electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, energy efficiency. We need to talk about retrofitting homes for efficiency, batteries, and of course green hydrogen. Many countries have already recognised the benefit of all this, but Australia is still very much lagging behind. But a lot of work's been done. Beyond Zero Emissions have done a calculation of around 355,000 people per year in work around the jobs plan to get to net zero. Same with the Clean Energy Council. So I released earlier this year the Climate Change Bill, which is a framework legislation to lock in an ultimate goal for the Australian government of net zero by 2050. Now, this is not a controversial goal. This is a goal that all states and territories are committed to, all our large corporations are committed to, and many, many European nations are committed to. So really the only person sitting not at the table at the moment is the federal government. This bill is drafted to mirror the provisions of the UK bill that was implemented in 2008 and has been really efficient in driving economy and driving their progress around the sustainability and a lot of sectors. So we can really learn from, they've got 10 years where we can learn for how it's worked. I mean, we recently had the New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian actually in a conference with former UK Prime Minister Theresa May, pointing out that it would be the stuff of dreams if we could only have that kind of legislation. Well, that legislation, I will be tabling it in Parliament in November, and I've been meeting with a number of coalition backbenchers and many people within the industry. The key aspects of understanding about the legislation, it locks into legislation a net zero target by 2050. Now, that is the minimum we need to reach to have a hope of staying under 2 degrees and as close to 1.5. I know many people would like to see it sooner, but I think we need to at least draw that line in the sand for all governments of Australia to say we cannot pass that point. Then we have 5-year emission reduction budgets built into the bill so that we have accountability. We have an independent climate change commission, which of course will ensure that we have accountability to the public, and then we can assess how we are travelling along that journey. Clearly, after the summer we've had, we need proper national risk assessment when it comes to climate change impacts, and we need adaptation planning. We can't have a situation where reports are made and drawn and warnings are given to government about risks across, whether it be environmental risk, whether it be health risk, or whether it be employment across communities, and that these warnings are ignored is a major problem. So the bill addresses all that. It is not prescriptive in saying how you have to fix it, but it is saying you have to fix it and you'll have to account to the Australian public at a regular basis. I think it's a really important starting point, trying to end the climate wars and put Australia on track for a sensible future. So we put the legislation on hold while obviously the pandemic hit initially, but it is really important that it come back to the fore of the discussion. The government will be presenting a budget in October that must address a clean recovery. And I should say a few amendments have been made to the bill, mainly to incorporate the government's technology roadmap, because a key part of delivering net zero by 2050 is regular technology readiness assessment, and that is something the roadmap can deliver, but it is not the complete picture, which is why it's really important that we still have the climate change bill. So thank you for having me on. I'm really excited about the work that the Mosman Council is doing. I know I've probably gone over time, so I'm sorry, but I'm really keen to take some questions later.
Thank you very much, Zali, and I do encourage all of you listening to put in some questions. We've got a list already, and we'll certainly come back to you, Zali, with some questions which have been put to you, and specifically around how we can influence your fellow politicians down in Canberra to cross the fence or make that leap of faith to actually address the science and do something about it. At this juncture, I'd like us to hear a message from Minister Kean, who, as I mentioned, is the Minister for both Environment and Energy. Within the New South Wales context, Minister Kean, I guess, has been quite outspoken in the space of climate change, and if you are concerned about climate change, he should be applauded for doing just that, and has spoken quite publicly on many occasions about an appetite to not only deal with climate change, but also the connection between climate change and catastrophic events, like Zali was saying, such as the bushfires we've just experienced. So with that, I might just play for you a recorded message from Matt Kean.
Thank you for the invitation to speak at this Mosman Council Climate Strategy and Action Plan Community Forum. Today I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I extend my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As I record this message, more than 1.2 million hectares of California have been ravaged by wildfires. It's an area almost as large as the Grand Canyon. We see news reports of fires burning hotter than ever before and dangerous fire conditions lingering longer than ever before. It all sounds dreadfully familiar to us here on the other side of the world as we recover from our own black summer. These are exactly the kinds of extreme weather events that climate scientists have been warning us about for decades. The climate challenge we face is monumental, but it's not insurmountable. The state of New South Wales has a net zero plan, which is fully funded with a $2 billion investment from both the Commonwealth and New South Wales governments, and a roadmap to cut emissions by 35% on the way to net zero emissions by 2050. And as we respond to the economic hit from the COVID-19 pandemic, we've hit the accelerator on investment in climate-friendly infrastructure that boosts growth and creates new jobs. It's a whole of economy plan targeting electricity and energy efficiency, electric vehicles, hydrogen, primary industries, coal innovation, organic waste, and carbon financing. The state government is leading by example. We're accelerating solar on the rooftop of New South Wales government buildings, and we're working towards a target of 30% of new government passenger fleet car purchases to be hybrid or electric by 2023, with 10% of purchases alone being electric. And we're seeking proposals to shift Sydney's entire 8,000 strong bus fleet to an electric vehicle fleet. Our net zero plan makes good environmental sense, but it also makes good economic sense. Today, everyone is competing for job creating investment, not just states, but countries, because the economic downturn is global and deep. International investors have made it clear that environmental sustainability is a key threshold for investment. We've had a phenomenal validation of the government's approach from investors in response to our call for registrations of interest in the Central West Orana Renewable Energy Zone. It's Australia's first coordinated renewable energy zone, the modern day equivalent of a traditional power station, bringing together low cost solar with wind, with transmission and storage to help meet our future energy needs. We got a whopping 27,000 megawatts of proposals worth potentially $38 billion in new private capital. That's 9 times the amount needed to make the renewable energy zone a reality. The government is also bringing forward investment in a renewable energy zone in New England, which aims to attract 8,000 megawatts of transmission capacity. This is the biggest commitment to cheap, clean energy in the state's history. We've made a great start, but there is much more to do. We can't do it all alone. The state government is absolutely committed to working with local councils to achieve real carbon abatement, big and small, because it all adds up. I'm looking forward to working with the Mosman Council and all residents as we build a cleaner and greener future for our state.
Well, there you go. You've heard from the Minister specifically about that strong commitment to climate change and climate change action. I'd like to infer there was the offering of a grant to Mosman Council, but I think that might be a bridge too far. We continue to get some great questions, and unfortunately, obviously, Minister Kean won't be able to answer them himself, but I'm sure we can record these, and I'll just note that there will be a recording of this webinar available in the next couple of days on our website. So we've heard from the Minister. It's now time to turn to some of the science and perhaps also the politics around climate change. So I'm now going to hand over to Professor David Schlosberg, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a Professor of Environmental Politics at the University of Sydney, but also wears the second hat of being the Director of the Sydney Environment Institute. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Mayor Corrigan and Dr. Irwin. Thanks to Zali Steggall for all of her work and Minister Kean for his leadership. And I do want to acknowledge that I am on unceded Gadigal land. So yeah, I'm the director of the Sydney Environment Institute and an environmental social scientist. My research teams have done applied work with the City of Sydney on their community engagement in their adaptation policy development, done work with Resilient Sydney doing research on actual community experiences of shock climate events. I'm also part of a University of Sydney-based research hub on the human health and social impacts of climate change funded by DPI and New South Wales Health. And my work includes a team examining the mental health impacts of climate change in rural communities. So that's all to say that my own academic interests and focus on policy responses to climate change are not primarily around issues of mitigation or fossil fuel use. My work is much more about the experience of climate change and of the planning necessary to adapt and live just lives in the midst of ongoing stresses and shocks of a climate challenged world. Yes, clearly, we absolutely need to end the mining and use of fossil fuels, end carbon emissions, shift our energy, transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, and other systems to 100% renewables. But the reality is, as we saw here last summer, and as we're seeing across the world now, no matter what we do in the next few years to shut down fossil fuels and build a renewables-powered future, some level of temperature rise and climatic change are literally baked into our future. We can absolutely limit these impacts by acting on mitigation now, but the science tells us what we can expect even if we could just flick a switch and shut it all down tomorrow. More fires, more storms and floods, more heat waves, more sea level rise, and more people, communities, species, and environments made more vulnerable. So no matter the state of local, national, global mitigation efforts, planning for adaptation and resilience will be one of the most widespread public policy needs of the coming century. And unfortunately, there's actually less adaptation planning happening now in Australia than there was just a decade ago. So my concern is not only about doing more of that planning, but also whether those processes and policies around adaptation and resilience are done inclusively, equitably, and justly. So I have just 3 quick points to make in this 10 minutes. From my perspective, we need to talk more about our existing vulnerabilities and the inequity of climate exposures. We need to talk about the public's interest in just climate solutions, including just adaptation. And we need to talk more about funding inclusive, adaptive, and transformative processes. So on the first point, let's just be clear that climate change is not only a threat multiplier, but a vulnerability multiplier, an inequity multiplier. And this isn't some future thing or some new thing. Vulnerable communities have long felt the very real impacts of climate change. We just had the 15th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans in August 2005. Katrina killed over 1,800 people as it impacted, and those killed were mainly poor African-American residents, many of whom simply could not afford to evacuate. No cars, nowhere to go, no support. And Katrina importantly exposed the relationship between existing institutionalized racism, institutionalized inequality, institutionalized exclusion, discrimination, and the impacts of climate change. And in the last 15 years, Katrina has been followed by many storms with the same kind of unequal impacts: more deaths, more displacement, more uninsured damage of property, more poor people left to fend for themselves. So right now, weeks after Laura hit the Louisiana coast, people are without homes, without power during a heat wave, and without water. And just this year, we've seen absolutely massive flooding in Pakistan, at one point a third of Bangladesh underwater, India suffering both floods and related landslides, and the decimation of the rice crop in Nigeria and parts of China. And that's just storms and flooding. Right? In addition, WHO estimates over 166,000 deaths in the last 20 years due to heat waves, which are Australia's deadliest climate hazard. Heat waves are the single biggest indicator of climate injustice because the difference in vulnerability is so stark. Who dies in heat waves? Poor people, mainly poor people who live alone. If you have an air conditioner and the means to run it, you simply do not die in a heat wave. So California right now is experiencing the hottest temperatures on record, and we can be sure it'll be the poor, the homeless, the elderly living alone, the already socially and medically vulnerable that will suffer and die. So this summer, I seriously doubt there will be as many heat wave deaths in Mosman as compared to parts of Western Sydney, or poor rural areas of the state. areas of both poverty and already stressed healthcare and housing infrastructure. And I suspect we'd see the same demographic breakdown if we looked at those impacted by bushfire smoke here and in California, those already vulnerable, more likely to suffer respiratory distress. So that's my first point to make, just in talking about justice and adaptation. So I start from the premise that the impacts of climate change are not distributed equally. We live under the reality of not only climate change, but climate injustice. The second thing I want to talk about is how all of this overlaps and engages and informs thinking about climate adaptation. What does a critical and thorough just adaptation look like? And on adaptation, as on so many things, there's often a deep disconnect between the framings used by policymakers and those used by community members and environmental groups. Simply put, most governments focus on risk management, risk assessment, and liability, while residents tend to be interested in the social impacts and in taking care of the most vulnerable. And we saw this directly when running the resident engagement for the City of Sydney as they developed their adaptation plan a few years back. My team led a 2.5-day deliberative democratic process for a random group of local residents who were tasked with reflecting on the risks and the policy proposals identified by external consultants. And what we saw from residents was an immediate shift away from just this risk framework and to a move that questioned vulnerability and justice and environment. So for example, on day one, a rep from the city showed the residents a heat map of the Sydney LGA taken late on a hot summer night. And it showed some areas of the city clearly hotter than others in order to illustrate the risk that heat posed in the city. But residents immediately pointed out that the heat wouldn't be a problem in the richer areas of the city. Those folks all have air conditioning. They pointed to the public housing at Redfern and Waterloo, where people wouldn't have AC. So the residents were particularly concerned about the impact of risks on the most vulnerable populations, and not just with heat waves, but with the inequality and the impacts of flooding, on issues of food insecurity and mental health and stress. Now, in addition, the resident panel was quite interested in bringing the impacts on the vulnerability of non-human nature, the flora and fauna of the city, from parks to bats, from the trees in their gardens to the pets they walked around their neighborhoods. The point here is that a panel of randomly selected residents, when tasked with prioritizing adaptation policies, focused on those most vulnerable, human and non-human alike. And you might say that's just Sydney, but we've seen the same thing replicated in many other areas. And that leads to the third point that I want to close on, and that's about the current need for more substantive and community-based adaptation research, planning, and policy. So during the bushfires last summer, the PM insisted that we need to pivot from mitigation to resilience and adaptation. Of course, it's not about pivoting, it's about doing all of the above. But the reality is that adaptation in the last few years, the federal government has closed the CSIRO Climate Adaptation Flagship in 2014. They've ignored the National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy in 2015 and defunded the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, which was a global model for adaptation research. And they did that in 2017. So put bluntly, there are two kinds of willful ignorance illustrated by the federal government when it comes to the reality of climate change and our need to mitigate, adapt, transition, and transform. So we obviously continue to have the willful ignorance of climate science at the highest levels of the federal government, but we also have the willful ignorance and the intentional exclusion of the knowledge, experience, and preferences of local communities that are now actually suffering from the reality of climate change. Think of that amazing image of the PM visiting Cabargo in the midst of the bushfires and literally turning his back and walking away from community members, telling him what they needed. The point is, if we're going to address resilience and adaptation, such work needs to be substantive, inclusive, and just. And for me, adaptation really has to engage with the preferences, with the knowledge and experiences of communities, especially the most vulnerable communities. Resilience practitioners here in Sydney and in Melbourne have done incredible work to illustrate the crucial nature of community engagement, and not just stakeholder engagement, but broad community engagement. That's part of the long-term planning, and that goes hand in hand with emergency management and disaster recovery, as we've seen over the last few months. So hopefully the newly established Resilience New South Wales will engage in such adaptation planning in addition to emergency response. And we need the same from local councils, and I'm really happy to be participating with you tonight. So I hope that before more heat waves, more fires, more regional flooding, more sea level rise, more climate anxiety, that we see more funding and planning for real engaged community adaptation planning. Residents can imagine different futures, more sustainable and just futures. We just need to ask them about it and get on with the change. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Schlosberg, and that was elegantly put. And I can see again more questions coming through. I guess we're getting three types of questions. Some of them are very technical, and they're about, you know, is the climate science real? What can we do? Are there any questions about the science? We're getting some that are very much pitched at an international federal level about how we influence our current crop of politicians. It sounds like some are going to be quite resistant to that, and are there new ways to attempt that? And then finally, we're getting some questions around quite locally, what can we do? That's a nice segue, which ultimately will find its way to our own climate change specialist, Dr. Irwin. But before we get to Ruth, let's have a pre-recorded message from our state member, Felicity Wilson, where she's having a conversation with Minister Kean, which you've already heard from, and a few questions from some local children who some viewers, and I think we've got about 170 had signed on. I'm not sure how many we currently have, but it's quite a number, who they may actually know these children, be the parents or even the children hopefully are in this webinar themselves. So with that, I might hand over to Felicity and Matt.
Thank you, Mosman, for the opportunity to talk about climate change. I'm really excited that Mosman Council is putting the effort and energy into putting together a strategy and action plan to address climate change. It's one of the key issues constantly raised with me by our community, and we have some really proactive individuals we'll get to in a minute, but I wanted to join with our Minister for the Environment, Matt Kean, here in New South Wales. Many of you would know him. He's a strong advocate for our environment, and you would see him always out there making sure that we're investing in what we need to create a safe and healthy New South Wales, Australia and the globe into the future. And one of the things that was really profound to me in talking to you guys tonight about climate change and the opportunities that we have is thinking about not just our own futures, but the fact Matt and I both have young children. One of the reasons I'm not there is I'm about to have one. And because we've got these young children, I do think it adds an extra layer of the enormity of the future challenge and opportunities, because we have to think about the future for everybody's children and our own, which I think is really profound. It can be scary, but it's a really good opportunity. And so one of the things that I thought would be a great way of working with Matt on this conversation tonight is reaching out to some of our school students and getting their questions for the Minister. So we've got a couple of those we'll go to in a minute, but I just wanted to make sure you knew who our Minister for the Environment was, that he is working really closely with me and with our colleagues on making sure that we can get the best outcomes for our state and our community, and he knows how important this is for Mosman locally, so I'm really glad the Council's working on it. Minister, you're joining us here tonight.
Yeah, Felicity, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you, Mosman Council, for your leadership in this space. On a personal note, can I just say thank you so much to you. You know, this is stuff worth fighting for, and there's no one more important supporting me in the government than you, Felicity, in making sure that we leave our planet to our kids better than we found it. So thank you for your outstanding leadership. We've got a big battle ahead of us. We've got to make sure that, you know, we're expanding and protecting our beautiful natural environment. That's why we're aggressively trying to expand our national park footprint. We've got to protect our marine estate. We need to deal with the challenge of waste. We want to see us reducing, reusing, and doing more recycling. These are some big policy challenges. But the biggest challenge that we have to deal with is the issue of climate change, reducing our emissions to ensure that we leave our planet in a better place than we found it. So we've got a lot to do, Felicity, and again, thank you so much for your help in moving the dial when it comes to hitting that net zero target and ensuring we get there by 2050.
Thank you, Minister. And those all resound quite closely with us here in Mosman. Obviously, you've joined me out at the National Park at Middlehead. We were investing quite a bit in the National Park there. We're also surrounded by the harbour. We care a lot about our marine environment. So we want to make sure that we're benefiting locally, but we really have a social conscience about the rest of the globe and our responsibilities. And that's particularly obvious in the questions we've got from our students. So maybe we should go to Soraya from Mosman Public School.
Awesome.
Hello, Minister Kean. I'm Soraya Christian Hare from Mosman Public School. It's clear to me, even as a 10-year-old, that we are facing a climate crisis. We are already seeing billions of people from our planet suffering from extreme weather events. I felt the impact of climate change personally. Over the new year, my family was on the south coast visiting my grandparents, and I saw firsthand the impact of the devastating bushfires. It was very scary. I've learned about the Paris Agreement and that Australia has agreed to keep the global temperature rise this century to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. To achieve this, we need to phase out fossil fuel burning and move to more renewable energy sources. Minister Kean, thank you for the opportunity to ask you a question. Could you please let us know what the New South Wales government is doing to move to more renewable energy sources? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Soraya. I really appreciate your question, and especially everything you and the Mosman Public School community are doing. And we've been really excited to get some support for you for the solar panels going on at the school. And I love your sustainability club and all the work that you're doing on the grassroots level locally, even going down to clean up Balmoral Beach, because I think these are small initiatives that individuals can achieve to make a real difference for our globe. So thank you for everything you're doing. But the bigger question, obviously, Minister, is what are we doing as a state for renewable energy?
Well, can I just say, Soraya, thank you so much for that great question, and more importantly, thank you for your amazing passion for our environment, and not just our environment, our future, because ensuring that we protect our planet is going to be key to making sure we not only have a great environment, but also a strong economy, and that's what this is all about. So the New South Wales government has recently released its net zero strategy. So that's about hitting zero net emissions by 2050. And we've set a 35% emissions reduction target for 2030. And we're well on the way to achieving that. But our strategy to do that is, as you said, to get more renewable energy into the system. The biggest contributor to carbon emissions in New South Wales is our electricity system. Right now, 80% of our electricity comes from 5 coal-fired power stations, and by 2035, 4 of them will come to the end of their lives. They need to be replaced, and the way they'll be replaced has been set out in the electricity strategy, which I recently released, which says that we'll be focusing on ensuring that we have reliable, affordable energy. Now, the cheapest form of reliable energy today, it's not coal, it's not gas, it's not nuclear, it's wind and solar backed up by pumped hydro. So this is not just good for our environment, it's good for families and businesses who will get lower electricity bills as we see more wind, more solar, more batteries, more pumped hydro coming into the system. A wonderful byproduct of that is it's also a great win for our planet. So our focus is on transitioning away from our existing older technology to newer technology that will be cheaper, it will be reliable, but it will also be far cleaner and better for our planet.
Thank you for that. So look, we do have a little bit more to hear from the Minister, which we will attempt to play for you if time allows, but I am conscious of time. I think we've got 2 more questions there that are put to both the Minister and our state member. But in the interim, I would actually like us to now turn our attention to Dr. Ruth Irwin. Dr. Ruth joined Council at the beginning of this year and has made great progress working with her team to ensure that there is a range of climate change activities being considered and implemented. And as the Mayor said earlier, some of those have been in play for some time. but she's also in the process of developing some documents that are going to assist us going forward, but also reaching out to you and the community through a variety of matters, which she will now explain and put to you. Over to you, Dr. Ruth.
Thanks, Dominic. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, which is the Warringah and the Camaragal people, and their kin relationship to country. It's a real pleasure to be here, and my task is probably bringing these big ideas that we've been hearing tonight from all these wonderful speakers into the much more narrow realm of Mosman. So some of it will be a little bit dry and a little bit sort of data driven. You would just have to bear with me while we do all of that. But I think essentially the climate emergency that the community asked the council to declare in November 2019 has made an enormous difference to the way that the council now operates. And I think the community at large really recognises that business as usual really hasn't been helping us to function, to have a functional relationship with the environment for a long time. So for 200 years we've had business as usual that is taking us in a trajectory that's really not amenable to continual life, really. So what's going on here is a transition. It's a subtle transition in many ways towards a green community, green economics, green law, green policy, and a green way of life. So this image that I've put up here is actually the fires from last summer. And I think that that's had a very, very profound impact on the way that Australians really view climate change. So although up until fairly recently, Australia has been relatively resistant to the idea that climate change is real, there really is no way to hide any longer. So what we can see is that last summer 1.25 billion animals died in the fires, and that's incredibly significant and extremely sad for all of us living here. And as David was saying a little bit earlier on, the vulnerabilities of people coping with the fires as they carry on, because I'm afraid that that's not going to be the last one, tends to hit the vulnerable more than it does people with access to things like air conditioning, or in the council's case that we can keep the library open and make sure that people have access to air conditioning that way. So that fire was at the stage of 1.1 degree above pre-industrial levels of temperature across the globe, and it's looking very much that we have already committed so much carbon dioxide to the atmosphere that we're almost certain to reach 1.5 degrees of temperature across the globe. And that involves wildfires, such as happening in California right now, ice melt, and 1 in 100-year storms happening nearly every year. So business as usual is the pink zone that you can see at the top there of that slide. And obviously it takes us into a temperature of, 4 or 5, even 6 degrees, which is completely untenable. So at 1.1 degree, we're already killing billions of animals. If we got to 4 or 5 degrees, then we would be deeply in one of the largest extinction events that the Earth has ever had since the dinosaurs went extinct. So we're all aiming for 1.5 degrees, hopefully, and 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels at the outside. One of the things that's happened under business as usual is that we externalised economic pollution. We externalised pollution from having to be analysed by the cost-benefit analysis. And that meant that we could divorce our relationship to the environment. So we had this very anthropocentric, very human-orientated view of the world, and that enabled us to be very exploitative in our relationship to the environment. I think with this green turn that's going on at the moment, this transition towards green community, green economics, green law and policy and way of life, we no longer can afford to have that very stark divorce between humanity and nature. And instead, we need to be starting to think about how these two things are inextricably linked together. So one of the things about a green community is that it's always going to be thinking about the way that the environment and the environment and humans are working together. We already know, if we take a very realistic look at what's going on, that our planet is dangerously close to its limits, to its boundaries. And finally, that our economic and technical solutions have to become more ecologically literate. So everything we do needs to put ecology at its centre. Rebecca Solnit says something I think is a very, very important way of thinking about things. So some people are looking at technology as though it's a solution that's going to solve all of our problems, and we don't need to really change business as usual much at all, except to add some technological solutions to the mix. That's probably not going to fly. For a start, we just don't have enough technological solutions to make that happen. So we really do have to start thinking about our lifestyle. But secondly, there's another group sort of at the opposite extreme of that, which is to say that, you know, all technology is bad and we should just abandon the whole thing and become sort of pastoral, back into the Stone Age, that sort of idea. But for 7.8 billion people that we have on the planet now, we simply cannot do that. There isn't enough land mass to do that sort of return to land. So we have to create a kind of a middle way that puts ecological literacy in the midst of all our decision making and all of our technological know-how. And Rebecca Solnit has this lovely saying, I think, which is to say that instead of falling into a despair trap because of the impacts of climate change, that action without hope is very difficult, and hope without action starves itself. So I'm getting to the nitty-gritty of what's going on in Mosman here. So this is our real progress over the last 6 months. So one of the things that happened after Mosman Council declared a climate emergency in November 2019 was that they hired myself and Nuala. So we make 1.5 people who are totally committed to climate change, which is a really big commitment for the council to make, out of a team of 3, which is looking at sustainability in general. We have been working really, really hard on developing new policy that will hopefully start to guide the council in making ecological decisions at the centre of everything the council does. So we're working on climate action policy. We're also working on quite a few mitigation projects as we do the policy development. So we've already, for example, put solar panels on the sports centre, and we're now in the process of looking at solar panels to put on top of the depot. And we're also putting an EV charger somewhere in the centre of Mosman, probably just behind the council buildings. So we're starting with mitigation projects, and we're also looking at policy, adaptation and resilience. Thanks, Nishan. So these are the 3 things that we're doing: mitigation, adaptation and resilience. And we'll move it along a little bit quicker than I was anticipating. Nishan. This is Mosman's emissions profile. So you can see that electricity is the biggest emissions that the community at large has. So most of the community engagement that we've been doing in terms of mitigation has been to think about how households can reduce their electricity. So we've done a couple of things, including a carbon calculator. So the carbon calculator, which is called Climate Clever, is available online. You can download that and have a look at how you can make your household more efficient. And the other thing we're doing is putting on little films on with the website, which helps you to put solar panels on your roof and know what questions to ask and what sort of pricing and so on. You can see there too that the Mosman region, Mosman LGA, has produced 132,000 megawatts last year of electricity, and in the last 4 years has gone from about 600 megawatts to nearly 1,000 megawatts in solar production from people's houses. So that's actually really good, and in this year it's going up even more quickly than that. And I think a lot of that is to do with community groups that are really supporting solar in the area, not just in Mosman but in northern Sydney. So a big sing out to you guys, because you've done an amazing job. The council itself has got 1,500 megawatts worth of electricity, which has come down from about 2000. So already there's been a lot of things that have been taking place over the last 10 years. But obviously there is some pretty easy wins for us to come down even further. Nishant, move the next slide. Right, so I wanted to think about resilience, and I think the thing with resilience is it's about thinking about our entire system as a socio-ecological system, as adaptive, flexible, diverse, and self-regulating. So we need to be considering everything we do needs to be considering how it has an impact on the ecology as well as our communities. So that's thinking about the vulnerable as well as the not so vulnerable. And I think one of the ways of doing that is to be stubbornly optimistic and not to fall into despair. That's a really important thing to bear in mind. So this is our action for the next few months. Most of our work is going to be focused on policy development, so we're really needing to get that written up and in front of the council very, very quickly. So that's going to be in front of the council next in November, and then it will go out for community consultation in December or January. So look forward to that, and you can see there's a list of a whole lot of plans, mitigation projects, community building, etc., etc. So if you have any questions, you can ask for further details. Thank you. Thanks, Dominic. Back to you.
Thanks very much. Terrific work. I know I did seek to hurry you up a little bit there because I was conscious time has been getting away from us. So look, now we're at that point where I'm sure a number of the audience has been patiently waiting for, and that's to throw some questions at the panel. As I mentioned, there's quite a variety, and some of them are just statements which you can read for yourself. But I might start with a really good question from Cameron early on in the piece, where he asked what was Mosman's reason to declare a climate emergency during 2019. Given it was a decision of council and a result of a notice of motion, I'm going to throw that one at you, Madam Mayor, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Look, I think that council, like many people in the community, had been really hoping that leadership was going to come from our national leaders, from our national government, from our federal government. I think that essentially very much an overarching plan, as Zali said, is not in place and needs to be in place. And I think basically the council actually got sick of waiting and decided that we needed to take the issue in hand ourselves. There were a lot of other local government areas declaring a climate emergency, and I think there was a sense that that's what we're going to do as our small community, and that if every community does the same thing and declares an emergency, that might be a stimulus to get more action on the federal level. But I think, as I said, everyone needs to play their part, everyone has to do their bit, and that was just we decided that was the year to bite the bullet and put our case totally into the public arena and bring in our community to join us.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think you've answered two questions in one. So there was a question there from Bob about what constitutes a climate emergency, and I think what you're describing is a sense of urgency. And I guess what we're hearing from other speakers as well tonight is that there is clearly enough data to suggest something must be done, and that's got to be done sooner rather than later. So I might move to Sherry Hardy, who has asked us a really good question about what it is that council might do in regards to integrating climate actions into our everyday decision making. So I'm going to throw that one to you, Ruth.
That's a very, very good question. It's not an easy thing to do, actually, because we have to go sort of through a policy making process to begin with, which is kind of a high level policy making process. And then from there, we'll probably have to look at the MOS plan, which is the plan that makes Mosman function for 10 years. And then there'll be a whole lot of other ways in which decision making needs to become greener. And it's not actually all about within council policy. So some things, for example, the building code is more federal, and that definitely needs to be a lot greener. It really has very little say about retrofitting or insulation or passive building or infrastructure or any of those things. So the building codex really needs some advocacy, which we hope to do. And we also hope to make sure that the community has access to a whole lot of really good information, really good quality information about things like passive building and retrofitting.
Thanks for that. And look, I might just add to that, obviously by a climate change emergency being declared by the council, you can be assured that it's now front of mind for all of us, including all the staff, and we will be taking it into account over time, as Ruth says. So the next question is from Cameron regarding, I guess, looking at other countries like the UK, how do we achieve that same bilateral appetite for action? And this one's for Zali. Obviously, you've knocked on a lot of doors and talked to a lot of people down in Canberra, but is there anything more we can do, and is there anything more you can do to try and change people's minds and maybe open their hearts to the idea of climate change action?
Thank you. Well, look, Cameron, that is a real problem. But I think just like the community in Warringah decided that actually environment and climate was an important issue, I think other communities need to do it. So what was interesting with Professor Schlosberg's talk was that, in fact, it's going to hit some of our most vulnerable communities, and yet they tend to be, some of those vulnerable communities don't even acknowledge or recognise the risk they are in. So it is, I think, it is a slowly moving tide, but it is moving too slowly for us to really affect the change we need. So we have some communities that are very aware of the impact and very educated on the impact and the risks, and are starting to demand more action. I would argue that it is about holding all of your elected representatives to account. So whether it be local government, so I certainly applaud all 3 electorates in Warringah have passed a climate emergency, but that is acknowledging a state of affairs that requires action. So it requires good waste management aspects. It requires, whether it's more composting facilities, LEDs, lighting, energy use, making sure public buildings have solar panels, making sure we have an electrification of transport. There are so many actions that need to be taken. Now, a lot of politicians will say the right words at election time. They will make the promises. They will say, yes, we're concerned, but they don't follow it through with actions. And that's the part where I think we need to say enough. So at federal level, unfortunately, we have inaction from the coalition government, and we have a number of people within the coalition that will say the right things, but ultimately they are as useless in the fight against climate change as a denier. So unfortunately, a very moderate voice is as bad as a voice like Craig Kelly or Matt Canavan, because their vote is the same. Unless they are prepared to cross the floor and represent the views of their community, they do not move the case forward. So I have been talking with them, but it's also raising awareness within the communities to understand that we actually can do it. The UK, it is a conservative legislation that I'm putting forward. It was passed by the Tory government in the UK. This is absolutely something that everyone should be able to get behind. But it's up to everyone listening. It's actually up to people in the community to demand change and demand action.
Thank you for that. I've got a somewhat tricky question, which I'm going to throw to you, David, so be prepared. And I'm throwing it to you because you're from America, and the question is an anonymous one, and it's a statement, maybe it's a question. It says, California is shutting down its nuclear power and now cannot power its grid reliably. Is there a message here we're ignoring?
Yeah, look, I really, one of the things I really don't understand, even, with a couple of decades in environmental politics behind me, is all of this love for nuclear. Nuclear, the economics just don't add up. The only places, California included, where things have gone poorly, who pays for this? Who pays for the building? Who pays for the planning? Who pays for the waste? It's the ratepayers and the taxpayers. So, the economics just don't stand up, especially compared to the cost of renewables right now. So I really just don't understand this sort of new love for nuclear that's out there. But in terms of stability of the grid, look, California has the same kind of problem that we do, and I'm not an expert, in the technology of this, but it's an aging infrastructure, and this is one, and this goes to what Zali is talking about and others. There needs to be some serious investment in electricity infrastructure in this country, right? And that's something to get behind more than nuclear, which not only doesn't work economically, but also affects vulnerable populations. I mean, this is where you get the uranium from. You get it from indigenous areas of this country and the US. So all kinds of reasons why nuclear doesn't stack up, and all kinds of reasons why we need investment in new technology that actually works at cost.
Thanks, David. Well said. And I guess to add to that is the notion that as the situation gets more dire, people are going to look wider and in more diverse ways for answers. And so I guess some of the decision making may be out of desperation. I've got a number of questions from someone called Bob. He's certainly got a few issues that he would like considered. And again, we're still at the global level, and I'm going to throw this one to Zali. How do we stop China building hundreds of coal-fired power stations?
Well, Bob, thank you, but there's a lot of misinformation in that question. So the reality is a lot of energy production is turning towards renewables. So in Australia, against action, it's always pointed to the example of China and India, and because they are so large, what can we possibly do? Now, what we need to be truthful is about the facts, about where Australia ranks when it comes to our emissions on a per capita basis. So on a per capita basis, we are the 14th largest emitter in the world. So it's really important that we understand that we are a big contributor. Now, where China is going, China being a communist state-run government, is the only one of the very few countries in the world that basically doesn't have to look at the economics, but can look at from an employment point of view. But even they are fast tracking their turn to renewable and are not fast tracking or increasing when it comes to coal-fired power. Same with India. In April, during the pandemic, we had one of the largest ever tenders for renewable power in India. They are fast tracking their development of renewable capacity, and they are very much not building new coal, and even their nuclear program is on hold. Now, a lot of people always turn to nuclear as something, but reality is, other than countries where it is state funded, it simply is not being built. There is only one other being built in the UK, and it is actually the worst. It's a cautionary tale. It was committed to years and years ago, and it was going to require massive subsidy by government. So this idea that the rest of the world is not transitioning is simply false information. There is a huge amount of data that shows that, in fact, many countries are transitioning away from high emission technologies. Now, but let's look at the positives. We have the opportunity to be a clean energy superpower. We are the continent with the most sun and wind available in the world. Why are we fighting this? This is our opportunity to be an energy superpower. Solar power will be the best source of energy to make green hydrogen, and that will be an exportable commodity. So I'm always really blown away by people who are focused on free market and competition and economic opportunity, and yet they don't want the economic opportunity that is staring us in the face. So rather than worrying about the fallacy of where China is going, it is really important to focus on what we need to do.
Terrific answer. It's like you're prepared. We might now hand over to you, Ruth. We've got a number of questions which are about Mosman and our own plans as council, but also what the community can do. Let's start with, will Mosman Council focus on biodiversity conservation in the face of the extinction crisis? And I guess it's well known that we are leaders as a country in making our native flora and fauna extinct. Is there anything you can say to us in that space, Dr. Ruth?
Yeah, I think Mosman Council has actually done a really good job with the planting of trees and the looking after the biodiversity in this LGA for quite a long time. So we're very lucky. It's a very leafy district, and it's got a national park. It's got the Navy base, and it's got a whole lot of parks that the council itself actually looks after. The council's got quite a commitment to planting new trees, more trees in the streets to lower things like heat. And we do a lot to make sure that the native flora and fauna are well cared for. That's why you see bush turkeys everywhere. The dilemma, of course, with things like fires is much bigger than the small Mosman LGA. And so while Mosman does try and use fire to keep the bush safe from fire, we really don't have we're not a big player when it comes to the bushfires that are happening in the New South Wales region. So we can only do our little bit.
Just as a follow-up question about Mosman Council, I saw there is a question from Adrian and echoed in a few other similar questions. It's important to fund these new climate projects. How is council sourcing these funds? Many councils around us are using a special green levy. Look, I've got to be honest, I'm not sure that I've seen any levies in all the councils I've worked in or understand that there is one specifically around climate change. But I guess the question and the heart of the question is how do we pay for all of these projects and this transition exercise?
Okay, that's a really, really important question, and it's one that we are only just starting to grapple with properly, I think. So we have a very small budget at the moment, particularly because of COVID-19. The council lost a whole lot of income, so we're really working on a very, very small budget right now. So we're looking at alternative ways of funding some of these things. For example, making public-private partnerships where other companies might come in and put in the LED lighting, for example, and the council might rent it back. So, you know, there are some ways around some of these issues, but funding definitely is an issue. I'm personally, unsurprising to most of you, including Dominic, would be quite keen on a levy. I don't think it needs to be called a climate change levy. I think it could be easily a sustainability levy, and there's certainly a lot of other councils that are doing that. And one of the things that we're hoping to achieve when we put together the mitigation list and do some costings about that for the 5 years is to make a case that we could go for a levy to start funding some of these capital projects for mitigation. And we're very aware that we want to reduce emissions as fast as possible because it makes a cumulative impact on what we don't put into the atmosphere. And we are very proud of the fact that Mosman Council has committed to reducing to net zero by 2030. So that's a very concrete target, and we are going to make sure that it happens.
Thanks for that. And obviously we will be incorporating the climate action plan into our MOS plan as well. So that should get some funding in terms of capital investment. So I've got a question here from Leslie for you, David, and it is around the notion that Mosman is a better off area than many others in Australia. And the question is, what is most important for our mainly wealthy municipality in relation to planning inclusively and equitably for adaptation? You want me to read it again?
No, that's perfect. I've got it. I saw that in front of me. Well, I mean, one of the things you did is vote for Zali, so that helped. But I think, look, even wealthy communities have vulnerable people. And you don't really learn about vulnerability until you talk to the community. One of the things that happened here a couple of years ago during a heat wave, and I lived in the inner west, which is also, you know, quite well off. And a neighbor of a friend had an elderly woman who died alone in her apartment during a heat wave, and nobody found her for weeks. And, you know, in a wealthy area, in one of the wealthiest cities in the world, we have that. So it's just a matter of talking to people and learning about where vulnerable people are, who the vulnerable people are. But it's also this idea of inclusion isn't just about vulnerability, it's about knowledge. And one of the things that we learned when we did the community engagement for the city of Sydney was just how much knowledge is embedded in community. And the consultants who drew up, I mean, there were 200 or 300 risks that the consultants had come up with, and they left out just an incredible number of things. They didn't think about wind, and, you know, within a couple of months after this, wind whipped through the downtown, knocked windows out, and and they fell to the street. And the consultants hadn't thought about that. They hadn't thought about parks. They hadn't thought about pets. They hadn't thought about the bats. They hadn't thought about the local environment. And people brought that up. And they brought their own expertise as well. I remember one person who mentioned that the tree planting was fantastic, but they were planting trees that were losing their leaves in rainstorms, and those were blocking drains, and so now people had flooding on streets where they never had it before. And just that kind of feedback, that kind of knowledge, you would think would be crucial for councils to get as they do this kind of engagement. So the inclusivity is important for knowledge. The equity is important just for the sake of justice. And you don't get either of those things unless you really engage with the public.
Thank you, David. I'm just going to wrap up with the last couple of questions. I'm conscious it's 7:15. It's a long time for anybody to watch. I think we've still got quite a lot of viewers, but unfortunately we've got about 60 or more questions, and I can't to get all of them. But I would like to end up with a couple, and then we might cut to the remainder of the questions put to our state member and Matt Kean to wrap up, and people can watch that at their leisure. So I've got a question from Kate Eccles. Many of you will know her, who've been involved in Mosman Parks and Bushlands. And it's about the notion that there is a dependency at the federal level on the fossil fuel industry and the donations that they may make to various parties or campaigns. Zali, is that something that is of huge concern, and has that coloured our approach to date, or do you think that ultimately the notion of donations is a side issue, and it's really more about jobs and our history that's dictated where we are now?
No, look, I think that there's definitely an issue when it comes to donations to the major parties. There are quite opaque rules when it comes to how sort of much disclosure there needs to be. We have actually stronger laws at state level when it comes to prohibited donations, for example, from developers or certain industry groups. We don't have any such restrictions at federal level. So there's clearly a concern about that influence. But what we also have in Australia is media law issues. We have a concentration of media, and unfortunately we've had a concentration of media in a sector that has been denying the science and denying the urgency of the problem of climate change. So it's sort of become this, it has caused an absolute paralysis in Australia, and it's really in a way that other countries just haven't had it. So in the UK, it was actually, they took action in a bipartisan way. All sides of politics came together to acknowledge that this was a common risk and a common threat that they all had a duty to address. Unfortunately, instead, in Australia, we actually, at the end of his prime ministership, John Howard was acknowledging it, but belatedly, but was acknowledging that we needed to do something on climate change and was prepared to look at stronger action, including price on carbon. And then, of course, we saw Labor introduce it. Unfortunately, this got weaponised in Australia for short-term political gain. There was a fear and smear campaign in relation to what the effect of those policies were, and so they were repealed. And we've had 10 years of complete paralysis in terms of taking proper action in relation to climate, in relation to policy. And what that's done is that has increased our power prices, that has increased the impact on our society, and in particular, as the professor says, on the more vulnerable in society. So I think it's really important that everyone be a little bit more, I think we need to expect more of our politicians. It's why I got into politics. I felt like enough was enough, and we needed to put some common sense back into this debate. Well, actually stop it being a debate. But I think, look, we also need to acknowledge we all have to change our habits. We all have to do our bit. So just as local governments are taking action, each constituent can make a difference. Look to yourself, look to your own actions, look to your footprint. We can all change our habits, whether it's transport, whether it's the energy use of our home. I would be curious, how many people that are listening tonight offset their emissions, for example, through tree planting programs. So even if you're not in position to put solar panels on your roof, do you buy 100% renewable power? Even when you don't have an electric vehicle, do you offset your emissions by going through a program? There are many out there. If you take a holiday, do you offset? So I think we all need to take a level of responsibility for the actions that are within our power, and then demand more of our elected officials.
Thank you for that. Now I've got time for one more question, and I'd just like to note that, Zali, your comments about trees and offsetting probably make Will Tuck and all the people who agree with his comments about trees being one of the vital planks to I guess, dealing with climate change. They'll take that to heart and agree with you. So the final question for tonight was put to us by Jokru at just before 7, and it's in the area of meat production. The question is, what is the environmental impact of meat production? Should council be encouraging a plant-based diet? Now that's a curly one and can be a personal preference. I'm going to ask each of our speakers tonight just to say in one sentence or so what their response is on eating plant-based diets instead of meat. I'll start with you, Madam Mayor.
Yes, a wonderful idea, and I need to do more of it myself.
Okay. Zali?
Look, I give you an example. My son at Mosman Prep in year 5, I believe it was, had to do a project of if every family in his year decided to have meat-free Monday, so one day without meat. He then calculated how many emissions he reduced it, and it was huge. So there are solutions. They're looking at seaweed to as part of the feed for cattle to ensure to reduce the methane production that comes from cattle. But I think we also need to think quality versus quantity.
David?
Well, I'll just say what we just passed at the University of Sydney, because we have a new university sustainability plan. Actually, the first the University of Sydney has passed. And there we had the same sort of questions. And what the conclusion was just to require all outlets to have more vegetarian and vegan options, just to put them out there more, rather than banning meat. It's just giving people more choice. And that seems to be going over very well.
Finally, Dr. Ruth.
Well, I have a slightly unusual view of this, which I think that it's monoculture itself that's the problem, including things like soil runoff and deforestation. And so you can have, you can have massive crops of, say, corn that is not particularly good for the environment, or palm oil, which is really bad for the environment. So I don't think that just switching to a vegetarian diet is the answer. I think it's about thinking about diversity in our ecosystem, which makes for healthy soil, it makes for healthy rainfall, and it makes for a healthy ecology. And that may include some meat, but not a monoculture of meat.
Wonderful. Look, just before I hand over to the Mayor to formally close tonight's webinar, I'd just like to make a couple of quick points. First of all, Rob asked us just recently, about our streetlights and whether we're transferring those to LED. Yes, that's definitely on the table, isn't it, Ruth? We hope to do that by the end of next year, using Ausgrid as a partner with that. They're offering to do it for us. Gillian's asked, could we publish the full recorded interview from the Minister? Absolutely, Gillian. In fact, after the Mayor's wrap things up, we're going to play it for those who want to stay on and listen, and it will form part of our published webinar, which will be available on our website next couple of days. So with all of that, I personally want to thank you for contributing, and I want to thank everyone for listening and for the wonderful questions. We'll try and answer as many of those on our website as well, but a number of them I note are more points of view rather than just questions. So with all of that, I'll hand over to you, Madam Mayor, to wrap up proceedings.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and I do want to thank our General Manager, Dominic, for chairing tonight's forum, and to all Mosman Council staff who've been working in the background, making tonight a really successful forum. I think we will definitely be having more in the future. wonderful roll-up of over 170 people. And just a couple of points that I took from all the speakers, such diverse range of speakers giving us such a full body of information to take away and absorb and think about tonight. But Zali, I think a great message about taking more personal responsibility. And also I would have to say on behalf of everyone here tonight, good luck with representing your climate action bill in November. David, thank you too for really focusing that idea about keep talking to your communities to really find that level of vulnerability. I thought that was some really good points that you made, and for us in Mosman, possibly things we don't think about, but I do want you to know that this is a community that definitely talks a lot. And I think that that's a very positive thing. I think for us, we feel really confident that our community will talk to us. And I think that that's a very, very important point you made. Thank you. I think we haven't got Matt and Felicity. I think they did a double great act talking to the kids. I thought that was a terrific initiative. I think also on behalf of the whole community, I'm sure everyone is with me when I say I hope Felicity has a very safe birth of a baby that looks very imminent to me. I think thank you, Ruth, for you to be telling the community that you and Nuala are completely committed to working on Council's climate action strategy and commitment, I think is tremendous. We're not a big council, and that's, I think, a true commitment to the cause. I don't think I've left anyone out. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the wonderful, wonderful questions. I think that they really showed that the community, as you said, Dominic, I think there's many more questions still out there. Thank you. Sorry we couldn't get to answer everyone, but the conversation will continue. And just good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending.
Thanks, everybody. Now we will just end with, I guess, the future that's to come, and that is the children dialoguing with our state member and our Minister for Environment. So please feel free to continue watching that, and at the conclusion of that, the webinar will end. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Because education is important. Through my education, I've learned about global warming and how it affects our world. And so it makes me sad to see the state government only spending a small amount of about 1.5 billion on environmental protection compared to other things. Also, we spend almost double the amount of money we spend on the environment on economic affairs, and most people might not even know what that means. So our question is, why do you spend so little on the environment compared to other things, yet it is such a big part of our lives and our future? I would like to thank the research team, Nadine and Annika, for helping me find out all this new information.
Thank you so much, Holly, and to Dean and Annika for the work you put into that question, and it's a really good question. And obviously we have a lot of challenges in making decisions about how to spend money. But before I throw to the Minister, I would like to say I'm really glad that you're getting bang for your buck at Beauty Point Public School. What a wonderful school. So I'm glad we're able to invest in your education and help you find your voice and the information that you need to ask us these questions. So thanks very much, Holly. Minister, talk to us about funding.
Well, Holly, great question. And I tell you what, if our $80 billion is going to see more students like you, then it's definitely money well spent. Look, we do spend a lot of money to protect our environment, and could we spend more? Absolutely. But it's not just about money. It's also about making sure we have the right protections, the right laws in place to safeguard our important environmental and ecological assets. So that's what we're working on at the moment. But it's not just about having the right laws, it's about making sure that they're enforced. And that's why we have a strong environmental COP here in New South Wales called the Environmental Protection Authority. That's the job of the EPA, is to ensure that we're enforcing our environmental protections to ensure that those assets will be there for our kids and their kids. Recently, the Commonwealth Government has been looking to consider whether they should have an environmental watchdog as well. My very strong view is that they should, and we should have a national environmental COP on the beat, out there looking out for our environment, enforcing the laws and holding the industry to account. So I'll continue to be a champion for that. I'll continue to be someone that supports strong environmental protections in place. and I'll be someone that always continues to fight to ensure that they're enforced.
Hi, I'm Zali from Middle Harbour Public School. Renewable energy is one of the most effective tools we have to fight against climate change. 2019 has showed the highest levels of carbon emission ever on our planet. The solar panels and the electric cars are great, but there isn't enough. The United Nations have given us 10 years to stop permanent damage from climate change. What is the New South Wales government doing to use the resources that we have in abundance? The sun. Is there any process to transfer sun energy into battery storage? Or is COVID and a more recession made renewable energy an impossible dream and climate change the next disaster to hit New South Wales?
Zali, that's such a good question, and you may remember from our conversations in the past that I'm Deputy Chair of the Environment and Planning Committee, and the New South Wales Parliament's actually been doing a lot of work at the moment into renewable energy and looking at some of these opportunities. And it's really interesting you looked at the COVID perspective too, because we've seen that as a particular challenge but also a really great opportunity. And the New South Wales Government is working on some really exciting opportunities in renewable energy, in particular across the whole state. So, Minister, can you tell us about what we're doing in the renewable energy space?
Well, Zali, thank you for your question. And Felicity, we might try and get Zali to come and do some work in my office, because that is outstanding research. Look, we've got some big challenges, as you said. I hope that climate change is not the next disaster to hit New South Wales. And I don't think that COVID-19 is going to be a roadblock to transitioning our electricity system and moving towards more renewable sources of energy. In fact, I think it can be a great opportunity. We need to be stimulating our economy. We know we need to replace a number of these existing electricity assets, like our coal-fired power generators. So what a better way to do it than bring forward the work that will need to be done to now and create jobs, see investment, particularly in the regions, and help set our economy up for a long and prosperous future. So now is the time to do this. But with regard specifically to getting more renewables into the system, we've recently announced we'll be investing in 3 renewable energy zones in New South Wales. So this is basically replacing fossil fuel-led generators with renewable sources. So we'll do solar, wind, pumped hydro, and yes, batteries on a utility scale. So we've announced the Central West Renewable Energy Zone out near Dubbo. That'll provide around 2,500 megawatts of clean, cheap electricity into the system. We've announced the Northwest Renewable Energy Zone up near Armidale. That'll be around 4,000 megawatts of cheap, clean electricity. So this is not only going to replace our existing sources of generation, but it's basically going to be built where the resource is plentiful, where there's lots of wind, where there's lots of solar. And that means jobs in the bush, jobs in the region, investment in the bush and the regions, opportunities being created where these resources are. And the benefit is that everyone across New South Wales will get a benefit from this, because it'll mean cheaper electricity. And that's not just great for families and businesses, it's great because it'll catalyse new industries and new opportunities that are energy intensive. They'll look to move here to New South Wales because of their access to cheap, reliable electricity. So we've got a big job to do. We've announced our plan to get it done. And now my job is to make sure that we get it over the line and we get that cheap renewable energy into our system that will catalyse an economic boom for New South Wales and indeed the country, particularly as we move to a net zero global economy.
Well, Minister, I think you can see we've got some incredibly bright minds and a great sense of social conscience in our community. Is this what you're hearing from across the state? Are you hearing particularly from young people, or is it all generations that want to see this investment in addressing climate change?
Well, I think everyone wants to see us ensure that our country, which is known for its beautiful environment, is able to protect that and take advantage of the opportunities that brings. I mean, it's a huge tourist driver. You know, people choose to live here because of the beautiful natural environment that we enjoy, and we need to protect that at all costs. But it's not just about that. It's also about the type of economy we want to have, the type of jobs we want to have, and you know, the opportunities we want to give our kids and their kids. So we shouldn't just be transitioning our electricity system for the sake of it. We shouldn't just be lowering our carbon emissions for the sake of it. We should be doing it because it's about looking after our environment and ensuring that we have a great you know, economic opportunity and a prosperous future for our kids and their kids and their kids. So that's what this is all about. And I want to thank you for your help in driving this outcome. We've got a long way to go, but you know, this is regardless of people's politics, this is about good people coming together to do good things. And I don't think there's a more important thing that we should be doing than setting up our future by tackling climate change and ensuring that we're able to take advantage of these enormous opportunities that are coming our way.
So thank you for everything that you're doing. Thank you for the efforts that you put in to constantly fight to achieve outcomes for our environment. We do have a long way to go, but I think our future is in good hands with you. So thank you very much, Minister.
Thanks, Felicity, and thanks for your support too.